So on CNN, a fight broke out. Not a fight. A fight where here you have CNN allowing Mehdi Hasan on their air. Mehdi Hasan was at MSNBC until he got fired. I have spoken about Mehdi Hasan repeatedly and his anti-Semitism, his anti-Israel sentiment, the palpable, to say the least, not having a conversation about policy, no matter what he may state. And he has a history of his own. Tony Katz today, great to be with you. With him is Ryan Girdusky. And Ryan Girdusky has been a commentator on CNN for a while. He has done some very, very good work over there. He's not necessarily the most polished. I would say that directly to him. But he is completely willing to go down the road. He is completely willing to meet the bigotry and the hate and the misinformation, quote unquote, and the lies where they live. Well, what happened here is an example of why is it okay for one person and not okay for another. William Jacobson joins me right now, Cornell law professor, the mind behind legalinsurrection.com. I'm going to play this for the audience. You might be able to hear this, sir, to get an idea of what took place. The British accent is that of Mehdi Hasan. The other person speaking is Ryan Girdusky.
You can't even talk about all of them because there's too many of them to get through. In fact, you should give a raise to the producer who had to do that supercut, that they had to sit through all of that. You didn't even get through all the clips. There was still Tucker Carlson doing replacement. Don Jr. did replacement. And then Trump himself turned up and talked about invading and occupying our country, which is the language of the far right. He talked about enemy of the people, which is Joseph Goebbels. He talked about enemy of the enemy within, which is literally Hitler. I mean, these are my problem is, I get it. Nobody wants to be called Nazis. It's very inflammatory. But if you don't want to be called Nazis, stop doing.
You're called an anti-Semite more than anyone else at this table.
Yeah.
And people sit there and no, by me, I never called you an anti-Semite. Okay. I mean, I'm not sitting here saying
I'm a supporter of the Palestinians. So I'm used to it.
Yeah. I hope your beeper doesn't go off. The thing is that
you just say I should die.
You should not.
No,
did you just say I should be killed?
No, I did not say that. No, I did not say that.
Hold on.
Did your guest just say I should be killed on live TV?
I said I hope
you. Guys, let me just stop.
You said you hope my beeper doesn't go off.
She's not a big supporter
of the Palestinians.
Hamas.
Guys, let me stop.
Palestinian.
And it went from there. The story is over there at Legal Insurrection. CNN keeps Mehdi Hasan despite Nazi smear, bans Ryan Girdusky over pager joke. Let's go into that. Pagers being, of course, how Israel went after Hezbollah fighters and was able to get them these pagers, get them to explode in unison. Break down what it is you heard in this back and forth between Hasan and Girdusky.
Well, I think it was basically two people insulting each other. One of them suggesting the other's a Nazi and all his friends and supporters are Nazis, and the other suggesting that perhaps he's got some sort of terror connection. So there you go. That's it. But it's really CNN's reaction that I think is the big story here. And as you mentioned, Mehdi Hasan is a very controversial figure. He was, and there are videos circulating on the internet of him in earlier years being what could only be called an Islamist, fundamentalist, extremist, using rhetoric about, I forget the exact terminology he used, but about Christians and non-Muslims, really horrific stuff, for which in later years he apologized. Then he got his start in media with Al Jazeera, the Qatari-owned propaganda outlet, which promotes Hamas, promotes Hezbollah, promotes anti-Western themes. That's where he got his start, okay? Then he got essentially cleaned up and went over to CNN or the MSNBC and had a show and burned out there. Now he's back at Al Jazeera. So this is a guy who has a history of being an Islamist extremist, who has a history of working for Islamist propaganda outlets sponsored by the country that also hosts Hamas in Qatar. And so, I think Ryan was making light of that, okay, making light of it in light of the, pager explosions that struck the extremists in Hezbollah. So that's what it was. I don't think it was the worst thing in the world. and he did quickly apologize for, maybe losing his control a little
Ryan
bit.
Girdusky did indeed apologize on air. That much did happen.
Yeah.
That is true.
Mehdi hasn't apologized for suggesting half the country are a bunch of Nazis, yet he's still at CNN. But CNN's reaction was that what Ryan did was racist and bigoted, et cetera. No, it wasn't. He didn't say that because Mehdi Hassan is Muslim. He said it because he's a known guy who is a promoter, maybe not crossing the legal line, but no doubt a promoter of, the Hamas and the Hezbollah and the Qatari line. And so, if it's appropriate for anybody as a joke, in response to a taunt that you're a Nazi, so I don't think it was the worst thing in the world. But of course, Mehdi Hassan, who's quick to call people Nazis, gets all offended that this was said to him. I mean, the whole thing's a joke, but it shows you how pathetic CNN has become when it comes to these issues, how it immediately jumped to Mehdi Hassan's defense,
yes,
immediately got Ryan off the air at CNN, and he's not coming back, they've announced.
And now, give me a moment.
That's really the story.
Talking to William Jacobson of Legal Insurrection, this was the apology from when they came back from break from the host, Abby Phillip.
We're back here, and before we get started, I want to just address what happened in the last segment. And first, I want to apologize to Mehdi Hassan for what was said at this table. It was completely unacceptable. When we get this discussion started, you'll see that Ryan is not at the table. There is a line that was crossed there, and it's not acceptable to me. It's not acceptable to us at this network. We want discussion. We want people who disagree with each other to talk to each other. But when you cross the line of a complete lack of civility, that is not going to happen here on this show.
So the line is when you refer to beepers, not when you call somebody a Nazi. CNN has made it clear in that apology from Abby Phillip that this is the line. It's acceptable to call people Nazis because you don't like what Donald Trump says, and it is unacceptable to engage any quip at all in response.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's a total double standard. It's a total reaction to, the sort of things that the group CARE does. Any sort of criticism of anybody who's Muslim, all of a sudden they claim is Islamophobic. And I think that's the setting in which CNN probably reacted. They didn't want, nasty statements. They didn't want petitions. They didn't want all those things. But they're not worried about that when it comes to Mehdi Hassan calling people Nazis. That doesn't seem to bother them, and that's really the problem here. The problem here is that Ryan was clearly joking with it. Mehdi was not joking. When he said it, if you listen to the tone in his voice, I'm paraphrasing, but I think pretty closely, he said, well, if they don't want to be called Nazis, they shouldn't keep doing Nazi things. So, he wasn't joking. Ryan was clearly joking from the tone of his voice. He quickly apologized for it. So why is CNN, punishing the guy who, was joking around and maybe on air at CNN wasn't the time for that joke, but and quickly apologized for it? It is not punishing the guy who's unapologetic. And I think the reason, frankly, is because the producers and maybe the show hosts, Abby Phillips and others, actually agree with what Mehdi was saying. I think that's what would come down to here, is that the reason Ryan is being punished is because he pointed out a possible uncomfortable truth and that they don't agree with. And the reason Mehdi is still on is that they actually agree with him. They agree with his statement. I think that's pretty clear from their overall coverage.
Talking to William Jacobson of Legal Insurrection, Mehdi Hassan, if you go back to his earlier days, as you mentioned, things that he has said in the past involve comparing non-Muslims and atheists to cattle. And talking about being gay as being transgressive of Islam. This is part of his statements, part of things that he has said, and he is allowed to apologize and continue. And yet his MSNBC career, as you watched it and I watched it, certainly was this portrayal that seem to hearken back to these kinds of conversations, certainly how he saw Israel, Jews, and American foreign policy as a whole. You're making an interesting point that this is the CNN point of view. But rather, this plays into what we see from the New York Times when we learned today that they were going after people, conservatives in new media, utilizing Media Matters of America for America to try and dismantle their ability to monetize on social media platforms. The anger that exists for the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times, now USA Today, for not endorsing Kamala Harris. How dare you not endorse the Washington Post losing 200,000 subscribers? This all fits into the space of how mainstream media is broken and isn't in the news business, but is in the narrative business. And it reminded me very much of something you talk about. And if you follow William Jacobson on Twitter X, W.A. Jacobson, you'll see that he'll write sometimes, for the 11 millionth time, academia is completely broken. And he's a professor at Cornell, law professor. It seems to me that you're talking about the same thing here. There is a clear broken media. There's a clear broken academia when you see this type of response.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that it is everything's become radicalized. Everything's become racialized. To use the saying, inmates are in charge of the asylum. And you have this notion that is deep now in the media, people who graduated these schools not that long ago, which has the same, approach to life.
William Jacobson, legalinsurrection.com. Find him there. Find his work there. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. There is much more to get to. I'm Tony Katz, and this is Tony Katz Today.